Hey, Shell Point, John High here, Academy Manager. I am back with Professor Adrian Kerr to talk about his next session, which is going to be held on Monday, February 10th, 4:30 to 6 in the Grand Cypress Room. Before we get into that, Professor Kerr, tell me a little bit about your connection to the Academy. You've been here for a number of years, haven't you?
I have, yes. I think it's coming up to 11 years,
11.
Which is just shot by. I started off talking on ancient Egypt. It was the first talk, and it spread to a whole series of talks since then.
Wow. Well, I'm excited to have you here. Once again, we're having you back in our semester here. And so we are finished up a 5 sessions on the ancient history of Rome. And a lot of that has brought into some question about the idea of the use of trade and how important trade and the trade industry was on world history. So talk about this session.
Thank you, John. It's great to be back at Shell Point. A number of your regular residents who come to my talks have quizzed me on certain aspects of how did trade develop and how important was it and what did people trade. And so we got to the point where I started to do some research as to how far back does it go and how did it change. And so we start off in the very, very early days, and it's really quite remarkable to think that in the period of, say, 1500 BC, a long time ago.
That is a long time ago, yes.
When people were making bronze in the Holy Land and in Syria, they've just analyzed that bronze, and of course it's made up of copper and tin. And the tin, it was shocking to find out where the tin came from. The tin came from Cornwall in England.
Okay.
So they shipped blocks of tin from England 1500 BC down past the Channel into the Mediterranean to get to the East Mediterranean to make bronze. So that was, in fact, that's why England was called the Tin Isles.
Yes.
So that goes back a long way. Another example of ancient trade was the bluestone, which is called lapis lazuli, which is often used in ancient jewelry, bluestone, and it was found extensively in the Tutankhamun's jewelry, which was 1200 BC. And then they started to say, well, where did that come from? There's only one place in the ancient world where that stone came from. It came from northeastern Afghanistan. So imagine digging it out of the hillside, putting in baskets, putting in a donkey or a camel, trekking across to Egypt. It would take 3 or 4 months. So there was trade 3,500 years ago internationally.
International trade.
International trade.
Wow.
And then, of course, they started developing the Suez Canal around the time of 500 BC. Who thought the Suez Canal was being worked on in 500 BC? So these are because the Persians wanted to have constant, get grain from the grain basket of the Mediterranean, which is, of course, Egypt. And then we go forward and we start looking at structures. So, for instance, when the Portuguese were heading towards India to get pepper. Pepper is the same value as silver, really valuable. How do you fund those expeditions? It's a big risk to actually build a ship and then to cover the whole cost of the expedition, hoping that you would get back in one
get
piece.
enough pepper to pay for it.
And get enough pepper to pay for it. If you got back, you get 4 or 5 times your investment. And that brings us on to investors. So you get wealthy people to say, will you lend me some money to build a ship to do the expedition, in which case you get a big return on your investment. Or, if we sink or get attacked by pirates, you lose all your money.
Oh no.
So
no insurance probably back then.
And no. Well, interesting you mentioned that. Of course, then you wind forward and you start to get more organized form of trade. You get banks. The Medicis, for instance, in medieval Italy, were the first of the great bankers, and bankers are called bankers because in Italian it's bancoros, and they sit on benches. That's the word for a bench. So you'd go along to Florence or Venice, and you'd actually see one of the Medici bankers and say, I want to borrow some money for an expedition, and they would write on their big book. And they would write down, I lent John High so much money in such a day, and then when you were successful, you come back and they'd cancel that debt.
Cancel the debt.
Of course, the next thing was development of risk management. And so it was a huge risk, and therefore the concept of spreading the risk came up, and it started in London, really, formally, in the coffee houses of London. There was a coffee house run by Lloyd's, a guy called Lloyd, and people who wanted to take out insurance on their ventures would come to the Lloyd's coffee house and write out an insurance document. And that's where formal insurance for maritime activity came about, and it still goes on today. And then we move forward to the next stage, which is the sophisticated joint stock company. And the Dutch get full credit because they really kicked this off in the late 16th century. And then the Brits followed on. So we had the Dutch East India Company and the English East India Company, and they dominated world trade through private enterprise. And so we go all the way through that history, and it shows that how the West made contact with India. And then further over, you've got to Malaysia, where the spices came from, and then Japan. The Portuguese traded with Japan. That was the first opportunity they had to do. They had exclusive trade for Japan for 100 years. And so we see the development of international trade, which brings us up to modern times.
Wow, the expansion of the world and the global connections that were made all because of trade.
Yes.
Wow. Well, Shell Point, you asked for this session, so we want to see a lot of you there. And once again, this session is on Monday, February 10th, 4:30 to 6 at the Grand Cypress Room. Sign up through the concierge desks. Thank you.